Good morning. It's really great to see faces today. And I wanted to, before I ask for some announcements, if anybody has some, I wanted to tell you a little bit about today's service. We're so happy to have some guests with us today. We've got our own Jim Schley. Today we're going to be, and we've also got the VTones plus our own Amber Wiley. We're going to be combining some great themes today. One of them is the 100th anniversary of James Baldwin's birth, and Jim has selected some readings and some thoughts out of things that he's been reading and working on lately. And the other is to kind of celebrate and all take part in a cappella singing. And for that, we have the VTones, three of the VTones, myself, Pat Attilio, and Stephen Dunn, plus Amber Wiley, who has stepped in as an alto, and we're just having a wonderful time collaborating today on the music for this. The music that we're going to be singing, and that you'll be singing with us in some cases, is has resonance with James Baldwin, and with, I would say, the past week, where there's been a greater sense of inclusion and youth and, a lot happening in our presidential, the presidential campaign. So I think you'll hear that in some of the music that we've drawn in today. So first of all, I want to see if there are any announcements that people want to make before we get rolling. There is, I do want to just call attention to the fact that at 2 p.m., and somebody else in here might be able to speak more to this, but there's going to be the last of the 4 speakers in our What's at Stake in This Election series. And this speaker is Jameson Davis, who's a graduate of Vermont Law and Graduate School, who's made his long-term home here in the Upper Valley, and is doing great work in equity and I think environmental law. I don't know enough about that, but I know I've had some interactions with him in the former area. And he's going to be talking about the individual rights, our individual rights that are at stake in this election. So it's been a really, really substantial series. We recorded each one. You can watch them if you missed them. They're on our website, and this is the final one. So if you can be here in person at 2 p.m. today, you can hear it in person, or later you can watch it online. Does anybody else have anything they want to add to the announcements today? Okay. So now we'll follow with our prelude.
I want to cross over into Canada.
In Christ was life, and the life was the light of the world. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. Let us pray for peace and the things that make for peace as we light the peace candle. Okay, so now, this is what I'm really excited about, is having four-part a cappella singing that you can all join in on. We have, come on up, VTones, I just want to introduce you, because you can choose a part that you sing along with. Are you a bass and you've never had that support from, the front of the church, or really have it, to sing along with? Follow Pat here in the plaid shirt. You a tenor? You want to sing that tenor, sweet tenor part? Follow Stephen in the dark shirt. Alto, Amber, and I'm on melody. But this is the first hymn we're going to sing all together is It's Me, O Lord. 352 in your bright red hymnal, the one that's kind of on the pew. Usually it's seated on the pew. It's a Methodist hymnal. So 352. It's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. It's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Not my brother, not my sister, but it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Not my brother, not my sister, but it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. It's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. It's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Not the preacher, not the deacon, but it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Not the preacher, not the deacon, but it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. It's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. It's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Not my father, not my mother, but it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Not my father, not my mother, but it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. It's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Hallelujah, Lord. It's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer.
So as Becky mentioned, this month is the 100th anniversary of the birth of James Baldwin, who for some of you was a person very much in your public lives. He became extremely adept at using television as a way to explore his ideas, and willingly placed himself in debate situations, most famously with William F. Buckley. He was also a fantastic essayist, and his essays from 50, 60 years ago have, as you'll hear, they have a freshness and they have an urgency that's undiminished. I'm going to read now a little piece of, it's called My Dungeon Shook, and you'll see in the piece why. And it's a letter to his nephew. For the benediction, I'll read a second piece of this, but I urge you to go seek out James Baldwin's work because he's a writer who's really lasted. So his name is James, his nephew's name is James, and this is the son of James Baldwin's brother. Dear James, there's one thing I want to mention. He uses purposefully the N-word, which I choose not to say. So I'm not going to say N-word, I'm just going to do this at the point when he says it, in my other reading as well. Dear James, I've begun this letter 5 times and torn it up 5 times. I keep seeing your face, which is also the face of your father and my brother. Like him, you are tough, dark, vulnerable, moody, with a very definite tendency to sound truculent because you want no one to think you are soft. You may be like your grandfather in this. I don't know, but certainly both you and your father resemble him very much physically. Well, he is dead. He never saw you, and he had a terrible life. He was defeated long before he died because at the bottom of his heart, he really believed what white people said about him. This is one of the reasons that he became so holy. I'm sure that your father has told you something about all that. Neither you nor your father exhibit any tendency towards holiness. You really are of another era. Part of what happened when the Negro left the land and came into what the late E. Franklin Fraser called, quote, the cities of destruction. You can only be destroyed by believing that you really are what the white world calls a. I tell you this because I love you, and please don't you ever forget it. I have known both of you all your lives. Here, have carried your daddy in my arms and on my shoulders, kissed and spanked him and watched him learn to walk. I don't know if you've known anybody from that far back, if you've loved anybody that long, first as an infant, then as a child, then as a man. You gain a strange perspective on time and human pain and effort. Other people cannot see what I see whenever I look into your father's face. For behind your father's face, for behind your father's face, as it is today, are all those other faces which were his. Let him laugh, and I see a cellar your father does not remember, and a house he does not remember. And I hear in the present laughter his laughter as a child. Let him curse, and I remember him falling down those cellar steps and howling. And I remember, with pain, his tears, which my hand or your grandmother's so easily wiped away. Now, my dear namesake, these innocent and well-meaning people, your countrymen, have caused you to be born under conditions not very far removed from those described for us by Charles Dickens in the London of more than 100 years ago. I hear the chorus of the innocents screaming, "No, that is not true. How bitter you are." But I am writing this letter to you to try to tell you something about how to handle them, for most of them do not yet really know that you exist. I know the conditions under which you were born, for I was there. Your countrymen were not there and haven't made it yet. Your grandmother was also there, and no one has ever accused her of being bitter. I suggest that the innocents check with her. She isn't hard to find. Your countrymen don't know that she exists either, though she has been working for them all their lives. Well, you were born. Here you came, something like 15 years ago, and though your father and mother and grandmother, looking about the streets through which they were carrying you, staring at the walls into which they brought you, had every reason to be heavy-hearted, yet they were not. For here you were, Big James, named for me. You were a big baby. I was not. Here you were, to be loved. To be loved, baby, hard at once and forever, to strengthen you. To strengthen you against a loveless world. Remember this. I know how black it looks today for you. It looked bad that day, too. Yes, we were trembling. We have not stopped trembling yet. But if we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. And now you must survive because we love you, and for the sake of your children and your children's children. I was really conscious to not say I'm sorry for being unable to just glide through that writing. And I think some of it is the safety of being in this place, but it's also, you know, one of the reasons I read, and I read constantly, is to have that happen, to have something break open. And Becky and I had the experience toward the beginning of COVID. We read a lot of, this is the Library of America's collection of Baldwin's essays. There's also a companion of his novels. And we read aloud in the car, and it's just glorious writing to be heard. And he wrote for the ear as much as for the mind. His thinking is very complex, but he, you know, hearing that Bobby McFerrin setting of the psalm, he had those cadences from a child. And he had a very unusual experience, which this piece I'm going to read two pieces from is called Down at the Cross. And it's looking back at himself as a teenager, and he had a feeling that he had to get himself out of danger, that things were happening among his peer group involving drugs, involving like leaving school into the streets. And he came up with what he calls a gimmick. And that gimmick was he figured out that he could preach. Now, he came from a line of preachers, both his father and his grandfather. But it had an enormous amount of power to see a 14 or a 15-year-old, and he kind of snookered the adults in some ways, although he was very, he was immersed in that tradition. He didn't stay conventionally religious, but all that kind of glorious, the syntax, the tone, that kind of control for him really came out of that. So mostly my goal here is to share an enthusiasm with you, but also to have you hear this really extraordinary American writer whose work is never been more relevant or less relevant. I mean, not less, but it was relevant when it was written. It's no less relevant now. That's what I mean to say. But also, there's something very interesting that I became really conscious of. This year I had the experience of Colm Tóibín is a novelist many of you may know. He wrote Brooklyn and a number of other books. Well, I was his editor for a book about James Baldwin. And one of the things that fascinated Tóibín was he, as a teenager in Ireland, was extremely drawn to Baldwin. So he reflects on why that would be. Their life circumstances were so entirely different. They had a kind of parallel relationship to the church. And that's one of the bases. They're both homosexual, they're both writers, they're both wrestling with the question of where did I come from? What is the meaning of the past? What's the possibility of the future? So there's this very interesting response that Tóibín, these began as a series of lectures that he gave at Brandeis University, but in the process of turning the lectures into essays, I got to be his rehearsal audience. So I was working back and forth with him, pretty much sentence by sentence. And there's something really significant for me that became more clear, which I think you'll hear in this. To be an activist means to be a very public person and to place yourself in situations that are, well, you know, we just saw this convention where people are willing to face a stadium. But to be a novelist means to foster and protect your interior life. And Baldwin was able to do both. I think a number of the speakers that we heard at that convention have also, they had the way of addressing individual people, not just, I don't know how many people were there, but there's something about this, the phrase that comes to mind is fiercely tender and tenderly fierce. That's something that we can learn from Baldwin. So I think I've chosen too much to read, tends to be the case. So you may find that there's kind of an abrupt stop because I have a really good sense of that's enough. Because I want to end with a little bit of what Colm Tóibín says about Baldwin. But meanwhile, here you are. This is the beginning of Down at the Cross, which I think was written something like 1961. I underwent, during the summer that I became 14, a prolonged religious crisis. I use the word religious in the common and arbitrary sense, meaning that I then discovered God, his saints and angels, and his blazing hell. And since I had been born in a Christian nation, I accepted this deity as the only one. I supposed him to exist only within the walls of a church. In fact, our church. And I also supposed that God and safety were synonymous. The word safety brings us to the real meaning of the word religious as we use it. Therefore, to state it in another, more accurate way, I became, during my 14th year, for the first time in my life, afraid. Afraid of the evil within me and afraid of the evil without. What I saw around me that summer in Harlem was what I had always seen. Nothing had changed. But now, without any warning, the whores and pimps and racketeers on the avenue had become a personal menace. It had not before occurred to me that I could become one of them. But now I realized that we had been produced by the same circumstances. Many of my comrades were clearly headed for the avenue, and my father said that I was headed that way. My friends began to drink and smoke and embarked, at first avid, then groaning on their sexual careers. Okay, I'm going to skip a little ways. School began to reveal itself as a child's game that one could not win, and boys dropped out of school and went to work. My father wanted me to do the same. I refused, even though I no longer had any illusions about what an education could do for me. I had already encountered too many college graduates handyman. My friends were now downtown, busy, as they put it, quote, fighting the man. They began to care less about the way they looked, the way they dressed, the things they did. Presently, one found them in 2s and 3s and 4s, in a hallway, sharing a jug of wine or a bottle of whiskey, talking, cursing, fighting, sometimes weeping, lost, and unable to say what it was that oppressed them, except that they knew it was the, quote, the man, the white man. And there seemed to be no way whatever to remove this cloud that stood between them and the sun, between them and love and life and power, between them and whatever it was they wanted. One did not have to be very bright to realize how little one could do to change one's situation. One did not have to be abnormally sensitive to be worn down to a cutting edge by the incessant and gratuitous humiliation and danger one encountered every working day, all day long. The humiliation did not apply merely to working days or workers. I was 13 and was crossing Fifth Avenue on my way to the 42nd Street Library, and the cop in the middle of the street muttered as I passed him, "Why don't you stay uptown where you belong?" When I was 10 and didn't look, certainly any older, 2 policemen amused themselves with me by frisking me, making comic and terrifying speculations concerning my ancestry and probable sexual prowess, and for good measure, leaving me flat on my back in one of Harlem's empty lots. Just before and then during the Second World War, many of my friends fled from the service, all to be charged there, into the service, all to be changed there, and rarely for the better, many to be ruined, and many to die. Others fled to other states and cities, that is, to other ghettos. Some went on wine and whiskey or the needle and are still on it, and others, like me, fled into the church. For the wages of sin were visible everywhere, in every wine-stained and urine-splashed hallway, in every charging ambulance bell, in every scar on the face of the pimps and their whores, in every helpless newborn baby being brought into the danger, in every knife and pistol fight on the avenue, and in every disastrous bulletin, a cousin, mother of 6, suddenly gone mad, the children parceled out here and there, an indestructible aunt rewarded for years of hard labor by a slow, agonizing death in a terrible small room. Someone's bright son blown into eternity by his own hand. Another turned robber and carried off to jail. It was a summer of dreadful speculations and discoveries, of which these were not the worst. Crime became real, for example, for the first time, not as a possibility, but as the possibility. One would never defeat one's circumstances by working and saving one's pennies. One would never, by working, acquire that many pennies. And besides, the social treatment accorded even the most successful Negroes proved that one needed, in order to be free, something more than a bank account. One needed a handle, a lever, a means of inspiring fear. It was absolutely clear that the police would whip you and take you in as long as they could get away with it, and that everybody else, housewives, taxi drivers, elevator boys, dishwashers, bartenders, lawyers, judges, doctors, and grocers, would never, by the operation of any generous human feeling, cease to use you as an outlet for frustration and hostility. So, with that, he put himself in what felt like a sanctuary, and he began to preach, and people loved it. And in the process, he learned several things. Along with that experience of going into the church as a teenage preacher, he had one teacher, I look at Joey as I say this, who with his parents' permission took him to plays, took him to the library, loaned him any book that he wanted to borrow from her library. And she was a person without a family. She was a white person who taught in Harlem. And I don't know if anyone's ever written a biography of her or made a movie about her, but a really exceptional story of somebody who recognized in this child. And his family was a bit ambivalent about it. They didn't exactly know what it was that was going on. But they didn't behave as though she were a predator. They behaved as though she were what we now call an ally. And it really made a difference in his life. He's written about that in other places. He doesn't in this particular essay. So I'm going to just going to read you a little more about his experience as a preacher. It turned out then, that summer, that the moral barriers that I had supposed to exist between me and the dangers of a criminal career were so tenuous as to be nearly non-existent. I certainly could not discover any principled reason for not becoming a criminal, and it is not my poor, God-fearing parents who are to be indicted for the lack, but this society. I was icily determined, more determined really than I then knew, never to make my peace with the ghetto, but to die and go to hell before I would let any white man spit on me, before I would accept my place in this republic, place in quotes. I did not intend to allow the white people of this country to tell me who I was, and limit me that way, and polish me off that way. And yet, of course, at the same time, I was being spat on, and defined, and described, and limited, and could have been polished off with no effort whatsoever. Every Negro boy, in my situation during those years at least, who reaches this point realizes at once, profoundly, because he wants to live, that he stands in great peril and must find, with speed, a thing, a gimmick, to lift him out, to start him on his way. And it does not matter what the gimmick is. It was this last realization that terrified me, and since it revealed that the door opened on so many dangers, helped to hurl me into the church. And by an unforeseeable paradox, it was my career in the church that turned out precisely to be my gimmick. For when I tried to assess my capabilities, I realized that I had almost none. In order to achieve the life I wanted, I had been dealt, it seemed to me, the worst possible hand. I could not become a prize fighter. Many of us tried, but very few succeeded. I could not sing. I could not dance. I had been well conditioned by the world in which I grew up, so I did not yet dare to take the idea of becoming a writer seriously. The only other possibility seemed to involve my becoming one of the sordid people on the avenue, who were not really as sordid as I then imagined, but who frightened me terribly, both because I did not want to live that life and because of what they made me feel. Everything inflamed me, and that was bad enough. But I myself had also become a source of fire and temptation. I had been far too well raised, alas, to suppose that any of the extremely explicit overtures made to me that summer, sometimes by boys and girls, but also more alarmingly by older men and women, had anything to do with my attractiveness. On the contrary, since the Harlem idea of seduction is, to put it mildly, blunt, whatever these people saw in me merely confirmed my sense of depravity. So he made his way through that, and hopefully I've whet your appetite for what he sounds like and how, that choice to write a letter, which is both public and private, to his nephew in that first piece I read. His essays work like that. You feel like these were written for me. And of course they were written for many people, but he has the intimacy of address that's just magnificent. So here are some observations by Combe-Toibin. Because and I'm going to anticipate for you where it's headed, ultimately all of Baldwin's work, his novels and his essays, come down to this idea that we don't change our country with policies and legislation, valuable as those are. That the only way is that we change the way we see each other and change the way we see ourselves. And love comes up a lot in his writing, and it comes, sometimes the essays crescendo to this kind of idea of loving, this very, very difficult idea of loving your neighbors and loving your enemies. You can't ever kind of say, I've got it, I know how to do that. So he challenges that, but he keeps saying it has to be done. So Toibin says, Baldwin's imagination remained passionately connected to the destiny of his country. He lacked the guile and watchfulness that might have tempted him to keep clear of what was happening in America. The ruthlessness he had displayed in going to live in Paris and publishing Giovanni's Room, which is one of his novels, was no use to him later as the battle for civil rights grew more fraught. It was inevitable that someone with Baldwin's curiosity and moral seriousness would want to become involved, and inevitably that someone with his sensitivity and temperament would find what was happening absorbing. Actually, he says all absorbing. Baldwin's influence arose from his books and his speeches and from the tone he developed in essays and television appearances, a tone that took its bearings from his own experience in the pulpit. Instead of demanding reform or legislation, Baldwin grew more interested in the soul's dark, intimate spaces and the importance of the personal and the private. In 1959, in response to a question about whether the 50s as a decade make special demands on you as a writer, Baldwin adopted his best style, lofty and idealistic and candid, while remaining sharp, direct, and challenging. So this is a quote from him. But finally, for me, the difficulty is to remain in touch with the private life. The private life, his own and that of others, is the writer's subject, his key and ours to his achievement. Baldwin was interested in the hidden and dramatic areas in his own being and was prepared as a writer to explore difficult truths about his own private life. In his fiction, he had to battle for the right of his protagonists to choose or influence their destinies. He knew about guilt and rage and bitter privacies in a way that few of his white novelist contemporaries did. And this was not simply because he was black and homosexual. The difference arose from the very nature of his talent, from the texture of his sensibility. This is another quote from him. All art, he wrote, is a kind of confession, more or less oblique. All artists, if they are to survive, are forced at last to tell the whole story, to vomit the anguish up. Baldwin understood the singular importance of the novel because he saw the dilemma his country faced as essentially an interior one, as his fellow citizens suffered from a poison that began in the individual spirit and then made its way into politics. And his political writing remains as intense and vivid as his fiction because he believed that social reform could not occur through legislation alone, but required a reimagining of the private realm. Thus, for Baldwin, an examination of the individual the individual soul, as dramatized in fiction, had immense power. So I'm just going to read one more little piece from Baldwin. And actually, this is from Toybin about Baldwin. And it will include a good place to stop for now. Baldwin, in his own writings, was often careful. He liked complex connections, strange distinctions, ambiguous implications. Thus, even in a time when gay identity was becoming easier to denote or define, Baldwin resisted the very concept of gay and straight, even male and female, insisting in an essay in 1985 that, so here's a quote, "Each of us, helplessly and forever, contains the other, male and female, female and male, white and black and white. We are part of each other. Many of my countrymen appear to find this fact exceedingly inconvenient and even unfair, and so very often do I, but none of us can do anything about it." Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. That was wonderful. We're going to follow that with something that we're going to do together. I hope I'm not taking this from anybody who needs it, because I'm going to take it right now. The next hymn we're going to sing together, 378 in the Methodist hymnal. You can turn to that while I'm talking. Amazing Grace is a great piece of American literature, of our American cultural heritage. As the story goes, that the words were written by John Newton, who was a slave trader and had an epiphany of the evil that he was doing, and had a moment where he repented and wrote the lyrics to Amazing Grace out of that. And it's become a really important work in the Black church, in the white American church, and all the American church traditions. So much so that, Bill Moyers did a wonderful documentary on Amazing Grace years and years ago that is worth looking up again, that, what it really embodies for people. So we're going to sing that, but one of the things that is part now of the Amazing Grace story is the incredibly horrific killing of churchgoers in a prayer group in Charleston, South Carolina. I don't have the year, but it was during the Obama administration. And at the funeral for those black churchgoers who were killed by a young white man who came in and prayed with them and then took out a weapon and shot people, Obama spoke, and he, at a certain point, just started to sing. He started to sing Amazing Grace, because there was nothing more that you could do at that moment. And the folk singer Zoe Mulford wrote a song that tells that story. So I'm going to invite the VTones to come up with their hymnals, and I'm going to sing that little piece, and then we're going to all sing Amazing Grace, and I think you'll know just when to happen. So have your 378, have your hymnal open to 378, and we are going to first hear a little pre-hymn, as I like to call it. Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you, Amber mentioned, and we're going to be singing verses 1, 2, 3, and 6. All right? Okay.
A young man came to a house of prayer. They did not ask what brought him there. He was not friend, he was not kin, but they opened the door and let him in. And for an hour the stranger stayed. He sat with them and seemed to
with all these different thoughts and your other thoughts that you have that you might not have shared, we're going to take 5 minutes just to silent meditation, whatever you want to keep in your head, and I'll bring us back after 5 minutes. Amen. So Jim, you have a benediction for us?
So I began with the first reading from James Baldwin's letter to his nephew, which is called My Dungeons Shook, which is a brief piece. It's one of those letters, like Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, that you realize the power of the form of a letter, that it's from one person to another person, but it also can include more people. So I read the beginning, and now I'm going to read the end of that as our benediction. You, don't be afraid. I said that it was intended that you should perish in the ghetto, perish by never being allowed to go beyond white people's definitions, by never being allowed to spell your proper name. You have, and many of us have, defeated this intention, and by a terrible law, a terrible paradox, those innocents who believed that your imprisonment made them safe are losing their grasp of reality. But these are your brothers, your lost younger brothers. And if the word integration means anything, this is what it means: that we, with love, shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. For this is your home. For this is your home, my friend. Do not be driven from it. Great men have done great things here and will again, and we can make America what America must become. It will be hard, James, but you come from sturdy peasant stock, men who picked cotton and dammed rivers and built railroads, and in the teeth of the most terrifying odds, achieved an unassailable, monumental dignity. You come from a long line of great poets, some of the greatest poets since Homer. One of them said, "The very time I thought I was lost, my dungeon shook and my chains fell off." You know, and I know, that the country is celebrating 100 years of freedom, 100 years too soon. We cannot be free until they are free. God bless you, James, and Godspeed.
Before we sing our benediction, I want to say thank you to each and every one of you for being a part of today's service, and also that we take our collection of little baskets on the table back there, and we hope you'll join us for some coffee and, I don't know, ice cream sandwiches or something, or what, just coffee maybe, in the other room, just a little conversation and visiting. This is the last of our 4 Seeking Spirit Sundays that we've had this August. Well, Tom Kinder's been on sabbatical. I think it's been a wonderful series. We've had Herbert be part of it. There was a great kickoff with Teilhard de Chardin as the focus, and Rachel Giraldi as well. And I really want to thank Joey and Danette for pulling together all these different ideas for this series. It really shows what we can do as an unpasteurized group. This last song we're going to do is usually thought of as a secular song, but I think you'll hear why we just feel like it belongs here, with a rainbow, with hope, with the different generations, and made famous by the amazing Louis Armstrong, very indelibly associated with him. So come on, VTones, for one last time. Thanks.
I see trees of green.